The Odyssey of Flight 33. They don't talk about the flight much anymore. At least the pros don't. On occasion, a vastly theoretical article will appear in a Sunday supplement, or mention will be made in a book on air disasters. But, by and large, the world's day-to-day catastrophes are sufficient in scope and number to take even the loss of a giant airliner off the agenda. But with the pros, it's different. It isn't that other flight talk takes precedence. It's simply that Flight 33 and what did or didn't happen to it carries a chill. Even now, just 11 months later, you never hear it mentioned in the ops room where the pilots chain smoke and watch the weather reports, nor in the control towers when the tense and tired men who talk the planes down get a respite for a quick cup of coffee and a smoke. There are other cases of disappearing aircraft on record, of course. There was Amelia Earhart, who took off from New Guinea for the mid-Pacific island of Howland and was never heard from again. There was the less well-known but equally tragic case of the two U.S. Navy 86 Sky Raiders on a flight for Fallon, Nevada, who never arrived nor left a clue as to what happened to them. There was the mysterious case of the two British airliners, the Star Ariel and a sister ship, the Star Tiger. Tiger vanished over the sea of weeds called Sargasso, which lies in the Atlantic off the Bahamas. 13 days later, Ariel followed her into oblivion. No trace of either plane was ever found. But Flight 33 was different. It was a jet airliner, beautiful, graceful, full of incredible power, as safe as any plane could be. And it simply had no business disappearing. It was too fine an aircraft, and whatever yanked it out of the skies was a power that couldn't be reckoned with on a design board or in an engineer's manual. That's why you rarely hear of it where pilots and crews congregate. Call it superstition, vestiges of black magic. Call it that strange and unspoken mysticism that somehow, incongruously, is to be found among the highly scientific body of men who fight gravity for a living. But whatever you call it, don't ever ask a captain, a first officer, or any crew member to talk about the trans-ocean flight that disappeared between London and New York on a quiet, otherwise uneventful June afternoon. They'll pretend they didn't hear you. Transocean 33 was airborne at 8:30 a.m. and left a fog-shrouded London International Airport under normal and routine circumstances. It was marshmallow and drifting whipped cream until the 707 reached 21,000 feet and broke into that incredibly clear blue sky, the vast universe that hangs perpetually and majestically above the crowded, dingy world. 3 hours later, the aircraft was 1,000 miles from the Atlantic seaboard. The crew and the 103 passengers aboard had enjoyed a pleasant, unruffled flight. They were on course and on time, and estimated arrival at Idlewild, New York, within a couple of hours. Inside the cockpit, Captain William Farver, a ruddy-faced 45-year-old pilot with several 100,000 hours of flying time, made a visual sweep of the instrument panel, a ritual he performed every 30 or 40 minutes. His practiced glance took in the altimeter, the Mach meter, the rate of climb indicator, the RAM air indicator, and the 24 other instruments whose dials, levers, and tabs were as familiar to him as shirt buttons to the average male. At his right side sat the first officer, Joe Craig, tall, youngish, blonde. Craig had a tendency to quick anger, but he was a good pilot with know-how and a mind not a half a beat from that of the captain. Farver looked over his shoulder toward the navigator. "Hey, Magellan," he said, using the sobriquet common to navigators. "How about a flight progress report?" "Coming up, skipper." "Hatch," the navigator answered him. "We'll be about 4 minutes behind flight plan at 30 degrees west." Second Officer Wyatt, who sat at the captain's left, removed his earphones. "Captain," Wyatt said, "Gander wants to know if you intend an altitude change after we pass 30 west. Advise Gander negative," Farver responded. Hatch took a sheet of paper off a clipboard and handed it across to Purcell, the flight engineer, who scanned it briefly and gave it to Farver. Farver checked it, then grinned around the tiny instrument-packed cubbyhole. "Gentlemen," he said happily, "you'll be pleased to know that thanks to the quality of this aircraft, the fine weather, and my brilliant flying, we'll hit Idlewild on schedule if our speed holds up." He handed the report over his shoulder to Wyatt, the second officer. "Send it in, Wyatt," he ordered. Wyatt put on his earphones, kicked a switch on the complex radio equipment, and spoke into the mic. Shannon, he said over the whistling jet engines. "Copy, Gander. Transocean Flight 33. Position 50 north, 30 west. Time 1500 hours. Flight level 35,000. Estimating 52 north, 40 west at 1431. Estimating Idlewild 1830. Endurance," by this he meant fuel, 7956. Temperature -47. Acknowledge, Shannon. He listened for a minute, heard the muffled voice at the other end, then flicked the switch. "Report received, skipper," he announced. Through the flight deck door in the rear of the compartment, Jane Braden, the senior stewardess, entered, carrying her 112 pounds like a rocket. Like a roquette, I mean. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was pulled back severely in a bun, but she still looked like a roquette and was built in the memorable words of flight engineer Purcell. Overheard in a bar one evening, like a steel-girdered, two-funneled ship of the line on her inaugural sailing day. Jane leaned against the navigator's chair, and Craig spoke to her without turning. "How we doing back there, Jane? Your passengers are highly content, but on behalf of the stewardesses, we'd like to respectfully request that we get to New York as soon as possible." She smiled, and the smile was bright and beautiful, much like the rest of her. "One's going to the opera," she continued. 3 have heavy dates, and the 4th is available to any honorable and single male crew member. There was a laugh at this. Purcell half rose in his seat to announce his qualifications in a piping voice that always made him sound like a bosun with a big built-in claghorn. Farver, laughing with the rest of them, suddenly broke off and stared out into space. Like many pilots, somewhere along the line, the captain had developed a sixth sense for anything amiss. It could be a slightly laboring engine that skipped once in 1,000 revolutions. It could be a stodgy rudder that an engine wouldn't pick up with a microscope. But a pilot could feel. Or it could be a sensation of something indefinable, something without a precedent that would suddenly blanket him with the packed ice feeling of impending trouble. And at 35,000 feet in a 600 miles an hour airplane, trouble wore 1,000 masks, 1,000,000 disguises. It could creep out of a crevice at any point along the 146-foot fuselage of a 707. Farver had that feeling. "Hold it a minute," he said. He stared off to the left of the instrument panel, obviously listening. Then he turned to Craig. "You feel anything?" he asked. Craig listened too. "Feel anything? No. What do you mean, skipper?" Farver shook his head. "I don't know. I felt something funny, a sensation of speed. His eyes ran hurriedly across the instrument panel. I can't even put my finger on it. Then he took a deep breath and seemed to relax. I guess I'm getting old. Craig glanced at the instruments. True airspeed 540, Skipper. We're level. Do you suppose we picked up a tailwind? Farver shook his head. Maybe. Those jet streams are tricky. I remember a TWA guy once told me he hit one that he figured was adding 200 knots to his ground speed. This is a crazy feeling I can't shake. You can't feel a tailwind, but I feel something. Craig shook his head. Everything looks fine, Skipper. Magellan, Farver said to the navigator, give us a speed check with your Lauren. Right, Hatch answered. He watched the grid lines of the black box in front of him, where the two pinpoints of light appeared and disappeared. His jaw tightened, and perspiration appeared on his forehead. I'd better do it again, he said. What's going on? Jane began. Hatch waved her quiet. Hold it a minute. Again he studied the Lauren. Skipper, he said tersely. Lauren indicates a ground speed of 830 knots. He shook his head, mystified. I've never heard of a tailwind like that. Farver's voice was tight. Check it again. Then he turned to Wyatt. See if you can raise OSV Charlie, air defense radar. Ask them to give us a fix and check our ground speed. Then he turned back toward the navigator. Hatch, you sure about that, Lauren? Hatch's eyes were glazed with concentration as he studied the instrument. Skipper, I'm not only sure, but we're accelerating 980 now. He hunched closer over the Lauren. 1120. 1500. His lips began to tremble, and his face suddenly looked white. Oh my God, he shouted. I can't even keep up with it. Anything from air defense? Farver barked at Wyatt. No, sir, was the answer. I can't raise them. Hatch half rose in his seat, his voice trembling. 2100. Honest to God, 2100. And still increasing. I hope the wings stay on. It was more than just a statement from Craig. It was like a prayer. They will, Farver answered grimly. Don't worry about the wings. Just watch that true airspeed. Ground speed doesn't mean a goddamn thing. We're just in one hell of a jet stream. He looked down at the instruments and then shook his head in total disbelief, which was almost shock. Magellan, he said, his voice raised. My needle just reversed on Gander Omni. He looked up. How in God's name could we get past Gander? Give me a fast position check. Hatch stood on his seat in order to put his head into the tiny astrodome over the cockpit. He took a fast fix on the sun. For a moment, he was silent. Then he said, Skipper, we're past Gander. We must be doing 3,000 knots. Taut, suddenly lined faces looked at one another, and fear, like an airborne virus, infected the room. Farver's voice cut into the silence. Try to raise Harmon Control, he ordered Wyatt. If you can't raise them, try Moncton or Boston. And at this speed, you might as well try to get Idlewild. Wyatt again went on the radio. Transocean 33, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Transocean 33, Harmon Control. Come in, please. Harmon, please acknowledge. Transocean 33, Moncton. Transocean 33, Boston Control, please come in. Transocean 33 to Idlewild Control. Can you hear us, please? Wyatt lowered the mic. No soap, he said quietly. Can't raise anyone. Fear was the silence that followed the announcement. It was the sweat on Wyatt's forehead. It was the grim set to Craig's face. It was the panicky fluttering of Jane Braden's heart. And to Captain Farver, it was an interloper threatening his coolness, his presence of mind, his ability to think and make decisions. The instruments in front of his eyes told him a lie. They couldn't be going that fast. Not and stay in one piece. Not and have the wings remain on the aircraft. Not without being shaken to pieces and disintegrating into so many tons of falling metal. And yet, they were continuing to accelerate. And the big 707 shot through the sky in a denial of logic and truth and mathematical equations. And inside its aluminum hull, the 5 crew members stared at their instruments. Deep inside, they acknowledged their fears and gave silent assent to their helplessness.